So welcome to the week 4 workshop. This week we're going to be learning about how to use pivot tables in Excel. Pivot tables greatly simplify the process of exploring large data sets by enabling you to slice and reorganize your data very, very quickly. Given that this week's focus was on people and places, we're going to be using pivot tables to ask some questions about the crime rate in Bristol over the recent past, so from the mid-2000s to about 2014-13. The questions we might ask are things like, which types of crime does Bristol suffer from the most? Has there been a rise or drop in crime in the recent past? Have people's perceptions of crime changed accordingly? Do they fear, for example, crime less or think it's gotten worse? And how have their answers to that kind of question changed over time? And finally, does fear of crime differ across the city? Are there certain areas of our city where crime plays more on people's minds than others? So we're going to be exploring those kind of questions through the use of learning how to use pivot tables in Excel. And they're the type of question that you can apply in your projects. And I'm hoping that many of the processes as we go along, you'll be thinking about, well, yes, my variable isn't type of crime, it's type of movie or type of happiness rating, something like that. So hopefully you'll be able to use pivot tables in all of your projects to explore your data a lot more easily. There is an assessment attached to this week's workshop, and you can find the details of that, of the 4 questions that are part of that, at the end of the instructions document. There will also be an optional extension task which will be posted later this week, probably at the end, by the end of play on Friday, that shows you how to use some of the location data, this very specific location data that we have in our crime stats dataset, to generate a map. Not unlike this Google Maps version here, but where you can see every incidence of crime between 2013 and 2010 and 2014 mapped onto a map of Bristol. So we'll be learning how to do that in a program called Tableau, which I'll explain how you can download in the extension task. But that bit's entirely optional, and you don't need to do that to be able to complete the assessment task for this week. Okay, so let's get going. So, as we've done previously, start by creating a new folder for this week's workshop. So in my workshops folder, I've created week 4, and this is where we'll be storing our files. When you've done that, I'd like you to open a web browser up if you haven't already, and search Bristol Open Data. Or you can visit the site directly at opendata.bristol.gov.uk. This site contains a wide range of data about living in Bristol that the council has made freely available. There are lots of different categories, and the datasets vary considerably in terms of their completeness and their quality. What we're interested in, though, are 2 datasets about crime in Bristol. The first of these is a version of the National Crime dataset that has been filtered out helpfully to show information about reported crimes just in Bristol. The second, which we'll come back to, is an annual survey of people's perceptions about crime in Bristol. Let's start with the reported crimes data. Type crime into the web page's search bar up here, and you'll get a list of different data sets that we could possibly be interested in. But for now, I'd like us to open up the top result, the Bristol Crime Stats one. And it says here that it's been filtered from the broader crime dataset. And you might be interested in this national crime dataset if you're looking at relation in relation to your projects. So the site's loaded a preview of the dataset right in the browser, which is really useful because we can see before we download what we're going to be getting. It looks like we're going to be getting a dataset that contains an entry for every crime logged by police as having taken place in Bristol. Each entry looks like it's going to get its own row. Some of them, they've been good and completed the crime ID for, others they haven't. We'd want to, if we were using this data extensively, we might want to work out if there's a reason for that, or if it's Do crime IDs only get allocated when the investigation reaches a certain level, or is this just a case of us having some missing data? We'd need to be clear about that. But it looks like each entry gets some data about the day on which the crime happened here, although the precise times I think we should be suspicious of, because they're all set to 12 midnight. And you can see that although we're getting a date here, we need to be sure that we were getting a kind of full range of possible dates, that they weren't just recording everything on the first day of the month, for example. Looking across the file, we're going to get some stuff about who it was reported by, and this is a key field because we know by looking at it that it's been entered for every single crime, and so later on we'll talk about how we can use that as a proxy for how many crimes were committed under each type. We get the area, which is going to be the same roughly, and then we get some more specific details about locations. So these are kind of universal national sub-area codes. This is obviously the more generic description of the location. And then we come across to the crime type, and if we drag across as well, so we've got things like antisocial behaviour, violent crime, burglary, drugs. Then we've got an outcome category that seems again to be quite incomplete or inconsistent, that suggests that there might be some data about the results of the investigations. And then we get some very specific location data in the last column, which we'll use in our extension task. And this is the kind of precise geo-coordinates of where this crime is alleged to have taken place. So on or near Arderton Walk, these look like the geo-coordinates for Arderton Walk. This is all very good as a preview, but to explore this data properly, we're going to need a local copy. And local copy is something you'll be hearing quite a lot about if you're reading kind of online tutorials, etc. on this. Local copies just mean stuff that's been downloaded to your computer. So what I'd like you to do is come across and click on Export. And we get these options, and then we could just download CSV, but given it says CSV for Excel, we may as well do that. So you click on it to open the download up, and you should get something like this. I've already saved mine in another file, but I'll find where I was working this time, workshops, and you may as well just save it as Bristol Crime Stats CSV for now. Great, so that's downloading, and then when it's downloaded, I'd like you to open it up in Excel straight away. Now, yes, we can play around and move our column widths, etc. But instead of setting data types and things this week, we're going to be getting straight into our analysis via pivot tables. So what I'd like to do straight away is to come up here and go Save As, make sure you're in the right location, and change the file type to an Excel workbook. So either .xls or docs.xls XLSX for the latest version, and name it ASC 04 crime underscore crime underscore stats. And now we've got an Excel version of our file, which is really important because pivot tables and any of our analysis can't be saved as a .csv file. So our aim here really was to answer some basic questions. So has there been a rise in crime? What type of crime is the most common, given that this data is about the actual crimes being reported, not the perceptions of crime that we're going to be looking at later. In previous weeks, I've shown you how to filter columns by values and turn the data into a table. So in week 1, for example, to get accurate, and how to get accurate subtotals for your filtered results by using tables, converting your stuff to a table in the actual spreadsheet here. We could do that here. For instance, just putting a filter on here for each different crime and having a total count column at the as our final subtotaling row, if you like, to find out how many of each crime had happened. But with such a large amount of data, if you look down here, we're talking about, again, a huge data set of kind of over 20,000 crimes. that would get pretty confusing, and it would take a long time and many different filters to set up a comparison between, for example, drugs crimes and violent crimes between 2011 and 2014. We'd be kind of adding layers of filters on, and given that they're all stored just up in this top row, we might forget which filters we had on, and it would become very cumbersome. The solution is something called pivot tables, which allow you to quickly organize your data and filter and slice it like we've just been talking about, especially when you have an entry for each person, event or place stored in the rows, and then lots of different information about that stored in each of the columns, all the variables that are about a single crime or a single person answering a series of questions, or a single place and multiple factors, or a single film, anything you like. If you've got lots of different entries down here and then you've got lots of variables about them, you should strongly consider using a pivot table. The first step to creating our pivot table is to quickly select all of our data, but without also selecting any of these columns off to the the right, that include no information. So any column beyond column K, because although it might look like this data is in column L, it's actually just overflowing from column K, and we can see that if we extend the column width. The key to using our Control or Command plus Shift plus direction arrow shortcut to achieve this is to find a column that doesn't have many blanks in it, since that shortcut stops every time it finds a blank cell. Fortunately, a quick look over the data suggests that column K, that location data that we're not actually going to be analysing in any great detail until the extension task, is present for every single one of the entries in this crime data. So if we start by just clicking on cell K1 up here, we should be able to press Control, Shift, and then down, or Command Shift and then down if you're on a Mac. And now we've selected all the way down, because there weren't any interruptions, to the last, there weren't any blank cells to stop it going, all the way down to the last row in our data. Now, because we chose the most right-hand column, we can do the same trick by pressing Control, Shift, and then left to select everything over back to column A. And now we've got all of our data selected, but none of the extraneous stuff over here, the extra rows L, M, N, O, or the extra columns L, M, N, O, or the extra rows down here in the 22,000s or so. So keeping that selection, I'd like you to press the Insert tab and then just hit Pivot Table. This brings up a dialog box that asks us two key questions. It's just confirming that we've got the range of data that we're intending to have represented in the pivot table. So this reference here is just a cell reference, which is telling us the Bristol Crime Stat sheet, that's the sheet we're on, and then it's saying go from cell A1, which is locked up there, and that's obviously our topmost, to the top left cell, right the way down to our bottom right cell, which is in column K, which we know the last column, and then it's this 22,000 or so cell reference, which is down here. So our data is right. If we wanted to adjust our data, we could do so via that button there. The next question it's asking is choosing where you want the pivot table to be placed, and we don't want to place it in this worksheet or another one we've already got saved. We want to create a new worksheet, so it's in a separate tab down here. So just press OK when you're ready. And voila, it's created a new sheet down here and a blank pivot table area here, which we're going to be clicking on in a moment. So the first thing we should do is we should rename this sheet Analysis. And I just did that by double clicking on the name and then pressing Enter to click off. Now, this is the area where our pivot table is going to appear. And you can see that we can still access the cells, and that's very useful. But the key area for designing the pivot table is actually over here on the right-hand side, this pivot table fields box, and we can see the full title if we drag it out a little. Now, We have a list of all of our columns here, which Excel has cleverly extracted from the data we gave it. And then we have these different boxes down here, and these are fields, and we're going to tell them, define how we're going to organize the data by dragging them into these different boxes, which tell Excel how to use those fields or columns in our table. For example, we might want to organize the massive crime data we have by crime type to see if one type of crime affects Bristol disproportionately. So drag crime type here down into the rows box, and we can immediately see that our pivot table comes to life, and we now have rows, if you like, for each of the types of crime that appear in our dataset. We also get this grand total line, which is going to be helpful as kind of totaling up when we get some values. But now we need those values to appear next to this first column in our table. And we want those values to be how many crimes fell into each category. Now, our data contained an entry, one entry per row, for every crime. If we counted how many rows there were for each type of crime, we'd be knowing how many crimes of that type that there were. So if you imagine filtering out, just so Excel was just displaying antisocial behaviour crimes, we could just count up how many rows there were, and we'd know that would tell us how many crimes had been kind of fell under that category of antisocial behaviour. Now, we can do that in a pivot table, but we're going to be doing it indirectly. And the way we're going to do it is because we know that this category called reported by, and some others, but in particular this one, reported by, was entered once for every entry in our data set. And that means that if we count how many reported bys there are, we're not kind of adding, because reported by was just the name of the police, we're not summing that together, we're just going to count how many times that appears under each category. That's indicating to us the number of times there were entries under that category of crime, which is the same thing as how many crimes there were. In short, if we know how many times the reported by field has been filled out for each of our crime types, that's a good proxy, in fact an exact proxy, for how many entries there were under that type, i.e. how many crimes there were under that type. So what I'd like you to do, after that rather convoluted explanation, is to just drag reported by into the values box. Magically, we get these lists, the values appear next to our subtotal, next to our crime types. And it's important that we just check that under values down here, it says count of reported by, because all we want to do, remember, is we don't want to sum together the different words that were in that reported by category or take an average of them. What we want is literally to know just how many times did it appear, was there anything entered for reported by for these categories, so that we capture the number of crimes. Sure, we could have created our own table just in this original spreadsheet here, I guess, by doing lots of different filtering on this category, and creating our own kind of table off to the side, as we did in week one's assessment task, and manually logging how many times everything appeared for each filter. But trust me, once you start doing this, you'll find this is much quicker as a pivot table, and it has three really distinct advantages for exploring your data. The first of these is that if we were to change or add anything to this underlying data, so add a new entry under a different crime type, it would quickly update here. So we'd just be able to come up to the Analyze tab under Pivot Tools. You can get to that always by just clicking on your pivot table, and then selecting Refresh. That'll refresh the link between this data here and the pivot table. We can also, the second thing is we can add new ways to organize our crime data on top of this by type. So we could have kind of subcategories here for every year, for example, which we'll be exploring in a moment. So we can really drill down and slice our data in different ways. And Doing that with filters again would be possible, but it would get very complex. The third key strength that is different from our filters is that our analysis is always now kept separate from our actual data. When we're filtering and sorting the spreadsheet itself, we're manipulating that data directly. So if we're to sort here on antisocial, we're moving all antisocial behavior. We're moving all of the rest of the data around that. And if we've created any values, new columns with formulas, for example, we risk changing that or making something not work quite right. When we're using pivot tables, we can rearrange our data and get these subtotals not only very quickly, but without compromising the underlying structure of our data that we've spent many hours kind of creating new fields using formulas for, or getting everything in the right data type, etc. if we were doing this as a full project. So it's a good way of separating out your analysis from the data it's using. Okay, let's move to some analysis of these crime stats. And they are just reported crime stats. So police only put the data up here for the reported number of crimes, and we might talk about why that could be different from the actual rate of crime later on. I think things would be clearer if we represented the number of each type of crime as a percentage of the total number of crimes reported. And at the moment, this is overall for our period as a whole, so through from 2010, I think, right the way through to 2014, all lumped together. We've learned how to do that and what something as a percentage of a total in previous weeks by using a formula. So for example, if we were to type equals B4 divided by $B, because we need to lock that cell reference in, so it's always going to be B, and then another $sign to lock it in the total, which is grand total is in B20, like that. We would get, and we changed it to a percentage by clicking on that, the percentage icon here. We'd get the result. That would work here because Excel can access this data as if it was a cell, even though it's in the pivot table. However, when we broke our data down further, for example, to have breakdowns for burglary in 2010, 11, 12, and 13, we'd find that our formula over here, if we just applied it down, couldn't handle new rows being added in between. So, for example, it won't let us add an extra row like that, and if we did, when we add a breakdown by time period over here for each of these, it'll mess our formula up. So we need a different way of approaching this. So if you did add the formula, just delete it off there for now. Fortunately, when we're using pivot tables, the solution is actually even easier than using a formula. So what I'd like you to do is click back on the pivot table and drag and drop another copy of reported by from the fields list into values. Check again that it's on count, and this should be an exact copy across, and it's just created it in a new column for us. It's important that you dropped it directly beneath the next one, because the order in which these are determines the order in how they appear in your table. So this is just the same data in column B and C. What we're going to tell Excel to do though now is to display the data that's currently in our third column of our table in column C. We're going to tell it to display that as a percentage of the grand total. So from the drop down arrow over here in our values field, just click it and then select value field settings. This screen we're going to be using later to change how Excel is calculating the data, so this is where we would set it to count. But for now, we just want to select show values as, and then we want to select percentage of parent row total, and press OK. And great, Excel has quickly said this, the data that was here is now a percentage of the total of all crime committed, or reported rather, during this period. Okay, so that's great. And what we can see pretty immediately is that antisocial behaviour makes up more of the reported crime than any other category or type of crime, accounting for 40.59%. Other things like drugs crime are as low overall as 2.37% of the total number of crimes committed, which, as we can see, for the overall period was kind of well over 20,000. The real beauty of pivot tables, though, is that they allow you to slice your data even further. We might, for example, want to know if antisocial behaviour made up that 40% of reported crime consistently throughout the period, or whether there has been a change over time. So whether it's become more or less important in terms of the overall, a bigger factor in terms of the overall number of crime. Again, we might be able to do that by using a really complex now series of filters and manually recording the results of each and tallying them up into a table. But pivot tables make things much, much easier. So to do this, all I'd like you to do is to drag and drop the month and year field here over into the rows box just above the crime type. And the order here is really important because we want a breakdown for each year, not each year to appear for each of our types. So we want our top level category, if you like, to be year, and then for each of those years we want to have a breakdown of each type of crime. Great. So if you make sure you can see, adjust your size of your Excel window so you can see this. Because in short, Excel realised that the format of this date, where it's taking it from, kind of allowed it to talk about, yes, the year, but also about time and month. It's been tried to be clever and has broken down this month and year variable into years, quarters, so which financial quarter of a year something is in, and then has left us the month and year if we wanted to know the precise date. Well, we're only interested in years, so what I'd like you to do is to is to click the drop down of each of these fields for quarters and press remove field. And then for month and year as well, you can remove the field. So now we're just left with years and crime type, and that's reflected in the organisation of our table over here. So we've got a table entry here for 2010, and then each of the types of crime that were reported in 2010, an entry for 2011, and then a longer list because it looks like there were more different types of crimes reported in 2011. And that might tell us something about why there could be a lesser number of crimes in 2010 reported compared to 2011, or it might just be that they're splitting out some of these categories into more specifics here. So other crime, for example, could have in the past could have covered some of these. The beauty of pivot tables is that we can minimize these by clicking on the plus and minus arrows as they appear. So if we just want the total number of crimes, bar period, there we are. We've got the subtotals there for each type. It's collated them all together. The percentage, importantly now though, tells us something quite different. It's telling us in these rows, it's telling us the percentage of the total here. So 2.12% of this total crime over our entire period was committed or reported rather in 2010. 31.75% of our total crime was committed or reported in 2011. So the function of the percentage has changed, but if we go back into any of these percentages we should see add up to 100, and that's because they're referring to the percentage of crime taking place in 2010. The reason it's working like this is we selected this as show it as a percentage of parent row. Now the parent row in this case is 2010 because it's the higher category. The parent row for these percentages here is 2011, so it takes the total for 2011 and uses that as the thing it's taking, representing this number as a percentage of. Now when we're talking about the overall totals here, the parent row is the one level of organisation above this 2010, which is the total overall, if you like. So it's when you want something like this where you want breakdowns and the percentages to adjust, you need to choose percentage of parent row when you initially set your column up. So feel free to have a play around with minimizing and maximizing these. Make sure you get back to a stage where we can see all of our data. And it might be helpful at this point to zoom out a little bit in Excel. One final tip is when you come next to a kind of subcategory like this, if you click just on the sweet spot between the row number and the beginning of the cell, so the line here, what happens is you get a special highlighter which highlights that particular category of data or type of crime in our case in every one of our breakdowns. So if we want to compare, as we're going to now, antisocial behaviour, clicking here and highlighting that row across all of our years is really useful just visually. So organised like this, we can see that antisocial behaviour has generally hovered around the 40% mark for 2013, 10 to 13, but coming down, it looks like it fell in 2014. During this earlier period, though, the raw number of antisocial behaviour crimes reported varied quite considerably, despite the percentage holding constant. So there's a much lower figure here, 1,927 in 2010, compared to that for 2011, even though that rose to 28,544, but the percentage barely, in fact, it even dropped. So this is obviously because the overall number of crime is rising, and the percentage is held steady as a result. But the raw number of how many offences were reported under this category actually increased. So this is a good reason why it's important to talk about change over time in terms of the raw figures, but also in terms of the percentage of overall crime they're making up. And you should be really careful about how that you're when you're discussing change over time, that you're accounting for both of those things. So this works later applies for our later period as well. So the 2014 percentage is lower than that for 2010, so it's 33% here compared to the 41. But of course, actually, we know there were, in terms of the actual raw numbers, there were more antisocial behaviour offences committed. So we might argue that a drop in percentage, if someone was just to tell us that percentage of crime that's antisocial behaviour had dropped off or had somehow become less important, we might argue that that's because the rest of the total number of crime has increased, if you like, and that actually the raw numbers of antisocial behaviour offences have continued to rise when you just compare 2010 to 2014. One of this week's assessment questions, which you can find at the end of this document, will ask you to make a similar assessment of change over time in 2 further categories. But what about our more basic question of whether crime has gone up or down generally, regardless of type? Well, to answer this, we need to introduce a subtotal for each year. Now, as we saw previously, when we minimise any of these columns, it does produce for us a subtotal, and that as a percentage of the overall crime through the period. But it'd be quite nice to have an extra line down here where we had that total for us anyway. And the way to do that is to come up here and press Design, and then Subtotals, and then Show All Subtotals at bottom of group. And there we are. We can just see it's had an extra line in. And as I said previously, note that the percentages in this line refer to each year's total crime as a percentage of the total crime reported between 10 and 14. So altogether, only 2.12% of our total reported crimes between 2010 and 14 happened in 2010. That's pretty unlikely to be actually correct. And one part of our assessment this week asks you to consider why our data might be misleading us on this point. So it might be to do with categories not being reported, or in general. So I think through the next exercise as well, you'll have some hints as to the potential weaknesses in this data. That said, the data does suggest that Bristol's reported crime peaked in 2011, but has been falling since. So this number here, 70,000, 195 total reported offences, making up 31.75% of the total crime reported in this period. Fell back to 62,000, making up just 28%. Fell back again to 60,000, roughly 60,000, making up a slightly smaller percentage of our total. And then right the way down in 2014 to 22,917, making up a much smaller proportion of the overall crime reported over the period. Now again, I think for your question you should think about, is that a real decrease, or has there been potentially, could the figures and way things are reported be affecting that? And that will be partly not speculation, but a critical view of kind of how this data has been collected and what it actually represents. That said, though, this is the data which people use when they're talking about the rate of crime having dropped or fallen in Bristol. So there does seem to be some evidence that crime peaked in 2011 and has been slowly falling in the succeeding period. Now, your assessment will return to those breakdowns of reported crime figures, but now we can turn to another dataset available via opendata.bristol. One that concerns the population's perception of crime in their area. If our data above suggests that reported crime has fallen, then we might expect people to have become less concerned about crime or less fearful of crime. However, there's a lot of assumptions in that expectation, however, so we should test whether this was really the case or not. Return to your web browser and hit the back button to get back to our search results for crime on the opendata.bristol website. If you'd closed the browser beforehand, you could of course just return and search crime here to get back to this page. I'd like you to open the first version of the Quality of Life-Crime survey that you see. So this again is an extract, hence the filter symbol here, from a much larger survey about the quality of life in Bristol that might be of interest to some of your projects. But it's been extracted, so it just contains the data relevant about crime. So we can click on here and we get the preview open up again. Now I'd like you to just repeat the processes described above for downloading a local copy of this data as a CSV file and then opening it in Excel and quickly saving it again as an actual Excel file called ASC04_quality_of_life_crime. And make sure you've got the right file extension for .xls or .xlsx. If we expand the columns where necessary to take a look at this data, what we can see is that there's an entry. This is kind of all in blocks. So there's an entry for each question here, and we can see that this goes on for ages. It's the same question, and then eventually the question changes. So all our results for this question have been lumped together. Why there's repeated entries for that question is that there's a repeated entry for every year, and then a repeat of this kind of overall entry for a question in a year for every of the wards in Bristol. Now, wards are just kind of sub-areas of Bristol that the council and electoral commission use to describe the kind of sub-locations or areas of Bristol. So, for instance, we have the question and then a year for Ashley, and we'll find this structure repeated for, if we just change the year, for same question, different year, and one for Ashley. So, what we're getting here is a block of all of the same question, then we're getting a block of all of the same year, and then we're getting all the different wards, and then we get another block where we have the same question still, but we now have a block of a different year, and then all the wards repeated again. Now, this is helpful because it's very definite that this question attached to this year, attached to this place, and then the wording of this question here, so percentage of respondents who feel crime has got worse over the last 3 years, suggests very strongly and correctly that this value here is the percentage of people in Ashley in 2005 who agreed with this statement, who felt that crime had got worse over the last 3 years, so roughly 20%. And then we have some location data again, which might be useful for us in our extension analysis. However, this would become quite confusing if we were having to filter for question, then filter for year, and then potentially chart results for different places. So this is a kind of another perfect use case for when we have a pivot table, because we have a question, an entry for each answer, if you like, to a particular question, and then information about the answer, so which year it was in, which ward it reflects, and location, etc. So what I'd like you to do is repeat the process of selecting all of the data and creating a pivot table in a new sheet which you'll rename Analysis. Once you have your blank pivot table like this, let's begin the analysis by taking a look at how Bristol's overall responses to these questions has changed over time. So the way to do that is to drag and drop the question field over here, which has just been extracted from our list of columns, and drag that into the rows box, and first of all, and then drag value, which is our percentage of respondents in this case, over into the values box. Immediately, well, depending on your version of Excel, we have a problem. The answer we get for question 1, which when we looked at it was response who feel crime has got worse over 3 years, is very odd. It's 8,061.16521% of people agree with that statement. So clearly something doesn't sound quite right. The reason is that we have the field set to sum. Excel's tried to guess what it is and has summed everything up, rather than obviously take the average percentage for each of our areas, which is what we're after. So if we've got a list of those different areas of Bristol, some places think 10% of people agreed, some places 15%, others 20% of respondents agreed with the statement in question 1. What we want to know isn't those three things added together. We want to know what the average overall of the areas response rate, percentage of respondents agreed with that statement that crime had got worse over the last 3 years. We definitely don't want to count either. We don't want just to know how many different wards there were, because if we did that, I can show you by going count, all we're going to know is that there were 315 responses to this question, and it's useful in the sense that it tells us that not every ward was able to answer these questions, and actually it's not every ward, it's more that these questions weren't asked in every year. But for our purposes, what we want to know is the average percentage for all of the different areas of Bristol. And the way we do that is just to come down here, click on the drop down, go to value field settings, and check average, and then press OK. Great, that seems to have fixed things. So we've got our numbers now here. 25% seems a much more likely answer, and seems to be working properly. And we could, of course, go and do a manual check using our raw data if we felt we needed to. Now, having a grand total row in this case doesn't really make a lot of sense, because it's just telling us what the average response to each of these questions is, and they're different questions, and that doesn't quite work. What are 24% of people agreeing to? The kind of average of these questions? It doesn't really make sense. So you can either ignore that, or what I would do is click on it, come up here to Analyze, at the tab Pivot Table Tools, and just select the Design tab. Then come over to Grand Totals and select Off for rows and columns. There we are, and it's gone. Now, if you'd like to format this up, I would suggest that you just highlight the column in this case, actually, because all our answers are going to be in percentages, and just press the percentage button over here, although that's not worked as it should. So what I'd rather do is just decrease the decimal for these back down to there. Okay. What we can see from this overall summary is already pretty interesting. This data covers the period 2005 right the way through to 2013, so it only partially overlaps with the crime data and crime statistics we just considered above. That said, it is surely significant that over 25% of Bristolians think that crime has gotten worse over the last 3 years. We'd want to test whether that number has dropped after the period in which we think crime began to fall, or whether in fact it's kind of stayed the same or risen. The penultimate question down here, second to last, suggests that nearly 24% of Bristolians are affected daily by fear of crime, and that question 2 suggests there are a much smaller but still quite significant, just nearly 7% of people who feel that fear of crime prevents them from leaving their house when they want to. I think we'd want to know if this fear was confined to a particular part of the city or not, or whether it was generalised right across the piece. The next 2 questions down from the start are interesting in terms of reporting the nature of reported crime. So 17% of Bristolians said they were a victim of crime during this much longer period, 2005 to 13. That's the average for each year the question was asked. So it's 17% per year. But only 42% of that 17% actually reported it. So just under half of these people, the 17% in any 1 year who felt they'd been victims of crime, just under half of them reported it, and that's why these aren't quite comparable, because this 43% reflects the 43% of the people who were victims of crime, not 43% of all people responding to the survey. The very final question in our list here might give us an interesting way of testing public confidence in the forces of law and order, for example. 38.4% on average in any given year felt that the police and local public services were successfully dealing with issues of crime and antisocial behaviour in their area. But let's start by breaking this data down a bit in terms of year by year. So drag and drop the year field from the fields list into the columns box area this time rather than the rows. And this is just going to change how our data is organised. So there we go. What we now find is that for each of these questions, we've got a nice breakdown for each of the years over here. And we could, if we wanted, add a totals row. This makes it very obvious that in some years the question wasn't asked, or that we don't have any data for it. So people change the survey questions over time, and although some of them they have consistently in there, others we only have from 2006. And this last one about confidence in public services and the police, they only started asking in 2010. These are still the average percentages though, as we can see, because they're the average of all the different areas of Bristol merged together. So 36% of Bristol in 2006 overall felt that crime had got worse over the last 3 years. And because of the wording of that question, we're going to have to be quite careful, because whether people were genuinely reflecting back over the past 3, so from 2009, looking back right the way back to kind of 2006, or not, or whether they were just asking in the moment of the day, is something we don't know. So if we're describing change in this related to change in our crime data, we're going to have to take into account the precise wording of this question. Now, eyeballing these numbers, and that's a technical term, gives us a general sense of change over time, but things would be a bit easier if we could visualize those changes using an interactive graph. So graphing with pivot tables is actually pretty simple, but it does have the effect of changing how our data is laid out. So when we graph this and start reorganizing it, the table that's generating the data will change itself. And sometimes that can be great because you just get a nice easy table to insert next to your graph in your document. But often we want to kind of preserve a base version of our table and then create lots of different rearrangements. So if we ever needed to reset our table, all we would have to do is kind of take a note of where the columns, rows and values, or potentially filters, how they're all set up at the moment and which fields are active. And if we just return to this configuration, we would reproduce the same graph. We might have to kind of stretch and expand or contract the rows or columns widths a little bit, but fundamentally we could get back to the same organization of our data. That's pretty time consuming though, and what I'd recommend is you create an exact copy of this table. And the way to do so is by clicking anywhere on it, coming up to Analyze, then Select and press Entire Pivot Table. Hold down Control+C or Command+C to copy, and then find somewhere just below it. So I'm going to put it down in here in row 14, select the cell, and you can press Control+V, but it can be easier in Excel pivot tables just to press Enter. And there we are, we get a nice copy of our table. Now we can adjust this, and any changes we make here won't affect our original pivot table layout above. So to start graphing, click anywhere on our pivot table. So it brings up the Analyze and Design tabs. Click Analyze, and then come across to Pivot Chart. Now what I'd like us to do is select Line from the left-hand list. Also just make sure you're selecting a basic line graph if it looks a bit different in your version of Excel, and just press OK. Now we've certainly got a line graph here, but it's not organized in any logical manner. We have a line for each year, strangely, not each question, and the questions are down here where we'd expect the years. So to fix this, we need to rearrange which fields are in which boxes, which is controlling what appears on the different axes. So essentially we can take a look over here, click on the graph to make sure we're working on this, and we might want to, while we're at it, move it down. We might need to resize it in a moment. And we're going to move the years across to the axis category because we want them across the bottom on our horizontal axis. And now we've managed to get years and each question, so we need to move the question back to the legend so we get a different line potentially. And we just need to expand our graph back out if it's messed the formatting up. And you can see, hopefully if we get it big enough, that we now have a line for each of our questions, and here in the legend it tells us which questions reflected in which colour. Make sure you just get it big enough so you're reflecting all of our questions. Now I guess this is good, it allows us to make some comparisons over time, but it's pretty confusing, and not all of these things are directly comparable, especially our people who reported it, because that's actually representing the percentage of not the whole population or respondents to the survey, but just those who said they had crime. So I think it can be easier if we were able to filter out which of the questions was displaying, and that's what I mean by interactivity in these charts. We don't need to start filtering our data, we can do it directly in the chart. So click on the drop down next to question here, uncheck select all, and let's just select one of the first question. So there we are. And now we just have a graph representing that question, and we've got the title up here and everything's looking good. The thing to note is that when we've filtered on the graph, it's now changed our table, and that's why we created a copy, so we've still got all the data up here. But it's now changed our data, so it's just answering this question and giving us the figures for each year. So this will be quite easy to copy and paste over into an Excel sheet for further analysis or into your reports. Now you can filter or format this, resize this pivot chart just like you would any other Excel chart. So for me, I'm going to press Design, and then I'm going to select something quite futuristic. There we are. I've quickly applied a format to it. As I've previously shown you, you can adjust the width and breadth of width and height, of this chart as you need. You can adjust the title formatting, for example, as well. So as I ask you to do in the instructions, we can have multiple questions filtered in here. So I'd like you then to add in question 3, so the third one down, the response who've been victims of crime. So we're now looking at those who feel crimes got worse and the number of percentage of respondents who've been victim of crime in any year, and press OK, and magically we get another factor here nicely organised for us. So we get the other line added to the graph. But I'd like us to add a filter on year as well. So on our x-axis, we can filter out 2005 because we don't have any data for one of our lines for that. And there we are, easily done. And I think now's the point in the instructions where I ask you to format the graph. For reference, I chose, I think, something called style 10 on this version of Excel. On mine at home, it's called style 7, but you can choose whatever you like. So in the instructions, I then ask you to repeat this process to create a new chart which displays data for the percentage of respondents who felt fear of crime prevents them from leaving their house when they want to go out, and the percentage of respondents whose day-to-day life is affected by fear of crime. And so the way I would do that is coming back up here to our first original table, selecting Analyze, over to Select, Entire Pivot Table, Control C, and then finding a new place on our workbook and pressing Enter or Control V. We have a new pivot table. I then come up to Analyze, click Pivot Chart, Line, make sure that one's selected, press OK, and we've got again this problem where we're organised by question and year, so I'd swap those over. There we are, and do some resizing. Make sure we've got everything on. I'm then going to apply my futuristic theme, there we are, and filter by those questions. So just deselect all of them, and it was percentage of respondents who feel fear of crime prevents them from leaving their house, which I think is the second one. Yep. And then the other one we want is percentage of respondents whose day-to-day life is affected by fear of crime. Voila, and that should look pretty much like it. Let's see what years. So from 2006, so I need to put my filter on over here to get rid of the 2005 data. There we are. Now if we zoom out just to look at these graphs together, and you can, it doesn't matter where your graph is compared to the data, so you could put it up here if you want. We need to be careful because the ranges aren't set quite equally on here, so we've got up to 40% here and up to 30% here, and if we were doing lots of comparisons between these, we'd want to make sure the ranges for our y-axis were consistent, and that, yes, the years, we had the same number of years in each as well. But taken together and kind of independently, these graphs suggest that both fear of crime and the numbers of people who are victims of crime have fallen in the recent past. So who feel crime has got worse, that's numbers come down over time, and at the same time we've had the percentage of respondents who've been say they've been victims of crime has come down for each year. Note that it's in the last 12 months that they're referring to here. Were they a victim of crime in the last 12 months? However, there have been times when the fear of crime has fallen more rapidly than the percentage of Bristolians who said they were victims of crime has declined. For example, here the percentage of the difference between the 2009 answer and 2008 answer is kind of nearly 5% less people saying that they felt crime had got worse, but the figure for people who are saying they'd actually been victims of crime in the last 12 months had remained relatively stable. So we want to do probably some calculations to see if these rates were kind of what the difference was between these two rates. But in general, I think this is good evidence that both of these figures have come down, but at times the fear of crime has kind of collapsed more quickly than the actual number of people reporting that they were victims. Indeed, this data only partly backs up our findings from the police data about reported crimes. 2011, for example, doesn't appear to have been a peak over here in crime, and that might be suggesting that 2011 was really just one point in a much longer term decline. Something that suggests our unusually low data for 2010 might have been making 2011 look like it was a peak going back up, whereas actually it was 2010 that was kind of unusually low for various reasons, artificial reasons, in our data set. And actually this was a much kind of more gradual period of decline in the numbers of crime. However, this second graph suggests a rather different story about fear of crime in particular areas. So the second graph suggests that the number of those whose daily lives are affected by fear of crime has decreased quite rapidly over the past few years, going from kind of over 20%, nearly 25% in some cases, right the way down to only 15% of people. So there's been a decrease here. But the second question, respondents who feel so in fear that they prevents them leaving their house sometimes, has been much more sticky. So it's not really moved as much, and actually it's been quite stable in the last few years. And this suggests perhaps there are a subset of people who aren't being, whose lives aren't being changed by the general fall in the fear of crime or perception of crime getting less worse. Sorry. Now, to assess both of these questions about the general collapse in the fear of crime and numbers reported of being victims of crime, and the stuff about people being so in fear of crime that they didn't want to leave their houses, we need to break our data down by sub-area of Bristol to ask if this is a general phenomena or if there's anything particular about some areas of Bristol. So to do that, I'd like you to repeat this process of creating a copy of our original pivot table. So analyze, select entire pivot table, Control C, and then Command C, and then down out the way down here, Enter or Control V. And I think it would be a good idea if we were doing this for a project that you'd be a lot more strict with yourself about giving these tables proper titles that reflected their particular function. So up here it would be kind of overall Bristol, if you like, for these particular questions, and the same for these. But we're just doing a kind of scratchboard type analysis, so as long as we know which table's powering which, that should be okay for now. So when you're here, click anywhere on the table to bring up our pivot table fields list again, and I'd like you to drag and drop Ward, so sub area of Bristol, into the rows box. Now we have breakdowns for each area, for each of the questions. And then breakdowns for each year, for each of these questions along each of the columns here. So this is our question level. We can subtotal that if we wanted by pressing the minus. And then we get a breakdown for how people answered that question differently in each area of Bristol. And then we can make a comparison over time. Now this is great, but there's an awful lot of data here. In some ways that makes it very powerful, but potentially a bit confusing. So it would be good if we could filter out so our table's just displaying one question at a time or a couple of questions at a time. And another quick way to do that, instead of kind of manually filtering over here by clicking on that drop down, is just to literally drag question from rows into the filters field here. And what that does is we're only going to ever have one table or maybe two tables if we've got two questions selected, and we're controlling it now via this question drop down here. So all is a bit irrelevant because it's just averaging out all the questions together. But if we click respondents who feel crime has got worse over the past 3 years and press OK, we now get a table that's just that question split down by area of Bristol and year for each of these across. What I'd quite like us to do though is to now actually have a grand total column. so that we can see what the average result for each of our areas was across the period. So 2005, 2013, what's the average of these numbers for Ashley in response to this first question? And the way we can do that is by clicking anywhere on our pivot table, coming up to design, selecting grand totals, and then on for rows only, because we don't want results down here totaling up just what the average was for 2005, 6, 7 across all our areas. We've already done that up here, and we now want to know the average result for each area, and each area is stored in a row. So on for rows only puts a nice grand total column in here for us, which is great. So now let's graph the results to explore this data a bit further. So follow the instructions above, if you're following along on via the text instructions, to produce a line graph for our ward level data. You'll likely have to swap year and ward around again in the fields panel, or you can just watch on as I do it quickly now. Okay, so we need to resize it a bit, and to get the full list of fields, we'd have to resize this graph and make it absolutely huge. All the data is being displayed, but it's just that we don't have the key for every colour line or every ward in the area, and that's just simply a matter of not being able to fit them all on the chart. So plotting all the results for all wards at once like this gives us a pretty messy graph, but it does tell us one thing visually, that the decline in perception of crime getting worse, so fewer people thinking that crime's getting worse over the last 3 years, has largely, although not quite entirely, been something that's been experienced right across Bristol. So all of these lines are, generally following a downwards direction when we look at them together. That said, by hovering the mouse over individual data points, we can identify some areas where this decline has either been slower or started from a much higher point where many more people thought that crime was getting worse. So for example, if we come up here and look at the top one here for Hillfields in 2007, well, we can see that this was kind of bucking the trend and was compared to the rest, and this decline generally has taken a lot longer, and it's still one of the top areas in Bristol for people feeling that crime is getting worse rather than better. Whereas in Henleys, the figure was a mere 14%, and I think that's down here, the blue one. Yep, a good example of one that's not fitting onto our key because we haven't got enough space. But Henley's down here, 14%, and so the start period, starting area, if you like, for this decline has been quite different for different areas in Bristol. So although we can identify this general trend, I think we also need to be conscious that your experience of whether you think crime has got better or worse seems to have varied depending on where you live in Bristol. Whilst being able to see all the wards charted together is useful for picking out general trends and outliers, we need an efficient way of visualising subgroups or individual areas. Constantly checking and unchecking these filter boxes in here would get pretty dull pretty quickly. Instead, I want to show you one final way to filter your data, and you can do this with pivot tables, normal tables in Excel, and these interactive pivot charts, and that's called the slicer. Now, slicers basically are a nice interactive box that allows you to click on and off fields, and it just makes sense I think more intuitive sense to see it. So click anywhere on your chart, or you could click on your table for this as well. Come across to Analyze on the pivot chart tools and press Insert Slicer. This allows you to select a field for the slicer to organise itself by, and we obviously want ward as that's what we're interested in. So press ward and press OK. And we get this box turn up here, and this is completely resizable, and it's a menu effectively, where we can now scroll down and see all of our different options, and when we click on one of them, it will select it and the graph will update and the table as well. So if we just want to see what's happening in, say, Bedminster, we can just click there and we get the individual graph for Bedminster. If you want to select multiple areas to look at, you just need to hold Control or Command and then select another one, say Bishopsworth here, or and you can check them off by just clicking on them again. If we wanted Brislington East and then Brislington West, we just hold Control after selecting the first one. And it's important to notice that it's not only our graph that's being filtered, but also the pivot table that's attached to it. So we can always get to the raw data as well as the visual analysis. And this is a really nice way of exploring your data. The one thing to be careful of, though, is that you need to make sure if you're just going to click down and compare kind of the shape of each graph, we need to set this axis to be consistent. And what I recommend is you just close the chart, set the maximum for this axis to 100, i.e. 100%, because it should go from 0% of respondents feeling that way up to 100. And then we're going to be consistent across the piece and across our questions. So that's adjusted. And now we can quite legitimately, as long as the years are all the same, make some comparisons between, say, Cabot and Clifton. And this is a much better way, I think, of exploring your data quickly and producing your graphs, rather than kind of constantly filtering your data and having to enter go create a new graph each time. Coincidentally, if you need to export this, i.e. to put it in a Word document or something, and because obviously the data is variable, if we were to export this to another Excel sheet and start changing things, the graph here would change, as would the graph in the other Microsoft program. What we can do is press Control-C to copy this, and then when we paste it in any Microsoft program, come down and choose Paste as a Picture, and that'll just take a picture that's kind of unalterable of our graph, rather than trying to embed the raw data along with it. So that's Control-C to copy, and then it's Paste or Paste Special, and you choose Picture. So the reason I'm showing you how to do this is not just so that you can visualize survey results in this way for different areas of the country, or different countries perhaps, or different kind of economic data, or cost of living data, happiness data, etc. It's because also your assessment this week is going to ask you to make some comparisons between areas of Bristol and the crime perceptions of crime there, whether that's in terms of fear of crime or feeling that crime has declined over time. So if I was you, I'd be using these kind of slicers to select the data you want to compare, and then referring back to the table for the raw numbers associated with that. And I should add that once you've done your analysis for one question, if you need to move to another question, you can just come back to our question filter up here and select a different one. So response whose day-to-day life is affected by crime. The question's changed, but we've still got our ability to select the different areas of Bristol to compare.